welcome back. This week a little packet of tickets, a little packet of ephemera that go with the paper pad from P13. By the end of my junk journal, I do end up using all of the tickets and all of the ephemera, and I did use the envelopes that the tickets and the ephemera had come in to make little pockets. There are these two pieces of Tres Jolie chipboard. I do put the one with the circle frame on it on my front cover, turn it into a little pocket with some flowers around it. And now to take a little flip through of the P13 Let Your Creativity Bloom paper pad. There are 12 sheets in it, 2 each of 6 pages of double-sided cardstock. To start, I used some 2-inch bookbinding tape just to add some reinforcement to the spine of my book. I'm going to go over the colors that I used to make my customized fabrics and papers for this junk journal. I have some Distress Oxide spray in bundled sage in that bowl with some water right now, and I'm just letting those fabrics set in there and pick up some of that color. And I do use some color steady additive since the distresses are dye inks, to help set them. After they have soaked in that water for some time, then I come in and I have a few towels layered up, and I have an old silicone mat in here to help protect from the heat, to help get all the spills, because this was a very, very messy part of it. And then I just start adding in some drops of Rustic Wilderness, the Distress ink. It's from the re-inker, so it's concentrated. I water it down, I let it bleed out, and I just kind of follow these steps, just adding different inks on my fabrics and letting them soak in, letting them spread out, letting them set up, and then adding the heat to dry them up. I come back in here, this is more of the bundled sage Distress Oxide, and that's just to kind of add a little bit darker areas, mix it in. This is the Distress Oxide for the Rustic Wilderness. I really didn't have a rhyme or reason. I just started adding colors until I thought that it was something that would work. That sopping mess on my map, I just brought in some papers, various papers from my stash, just plain white copy paper, some notepad paper, and just let it absorb some of the liquid that was on that mat, just to add some matching tint to those papers. For the pink hued fabrics and papers, I use some saltwater taffy and some Kitsch Flamingo. Alright, all of my fabrics are dyed and my papers are dyed and everything's dried, and now it is time to work on assembly. So I just start by, I kind of sort through the fabrics I've dyed and some other bits and pieces that I have in my stash, and try to put together some combinations and rip them up into strips to use as the book cover, or to use to sew 2 pages together and use as a hinge. With my strips made up, I start laying them out, kind of getting a general idea of how I'm going to put them together on the book cover, or to make the book cover. And I do use a thin piece of interfacing as a backing, and that's just to make sure that all of the strips will have something to stitch down onto when I take it over to my sewing machine. Everything is stitched together around back and do a little bit of light trimming, make sure that it is going to wrap around the cover the way I want it to, and then start trying to work out the layers that I want to use for the tie closure. My closures are just made out of a few layers of fabric and some light pink nylon cording that I had, so I thought that that would work well in there because the nylon cording is really very strong and it gives a little bit of thickness to that fabric so that there won't be knots. I trim it down so that at least one end of it is even. That way I can tuck it into the little slot in the cover. So I just use my craft knife and very carefully cut a slot in the edge of the cover, and after I've used my craft knife to get it started, I use my metal palette knife to work my way in. The edges of metal palette knives are relatively sharp, but it's also wider, so I could really kind of work my way in deeper. And then just using some 3D matte gel, I fill in the hole, and then I work the end of my tie closure down into there. I wrap some parchment paper around the tie and the book cover so that it won't get a mess everywhere, and then I just use some bookbinding clips to hold it together right at that edge and give that 3D gel some time to set up. While that gel is setting up, I grab up my paper cutter, grab up the sheets of paper that I want to use for pages and for the inside cover, which in total for the pages and the inside cover I use half of the stack. The other half I cut up as I go along when I'm putting it together in the end to make tuck-in spots or tags. So for the base assembly I use 6 sheets, and then for the embellishment parts I use the other 6 sheets of that stack. So I just go through, I'm getting everything cut up right now and getting it ready to go. When it came time for me to kind of work out how I wanted to do the regular copy paper that I had dyed, this is where I came up with using them overlap on each other, because the way they had been torn previously, one sheet wouldn't go all the way across. So I decided to overlap them, and that would give them both a little bit of strength where they would be stitched into the book, and then the stitches at the overlap would be a little bit more interest and texture in the junk journal. After my gel, it wasn't all the way dry yet, but it had set up quite a bit, I grabbed up some 3/16 inch eyelets and my crocodile, popped in 2 holes for each side, and put those eyelets in. They're not long eyelets, they don't really make it all the way through and wrap around like an eyelet does. So what I did is I used double-sided tape to kind of close off the eyelets while I put in some E6000 so that that closure would be nice and secure. I just grabbed up some white cardstock, kind of medium weight cardstock there, it's not heavy, and grabbed up my We Are Memory Keepers envelope punch board, and my envelopes are cut to the size that would hold a 5x8 card, so they're a little over 5x8, and I just made up these envelopes and I didn't fold them up. That way when I stitched them down to the pieces I was going to use for their hinging to the other page attached to them, that layer of stitching would be inside when I did fold up the envelopes. Now it is time. I have my strips of fabric, my bits of lace cut to the length I want, and I'm just going to start getting all of my pieces put together, kind of layering them up, getting everything matched up, putting it all in a stack so that I can take everything that I want sewn over to the sewing machine and get all of my pages ready to be put in the cover. My regular sheets of paper are stitched together, and I had cut them to the right height before I stitched them together, but it wasn't until after I had done my stitching, then I folded them where I wanted them folded, and then trimmed them down to size just to make sure everything matched up. All of my other pages have their hinges stitched in place, and now I am going to be ready to get my signatures layered up so I can start putting the book together. As I layered everything up for my signatures, I popped in a few sheets of notebook paper, some ledger paper, some old address paper that would have gone in an address book, and got my signatures layered up the way I wanted to put them in. Alright, this was something that I had kind of been thinking about on and off while I was working on the rest of the junk journal. And I just have this kind of light olive, kind of dark sageish masking paper that I thought it would work a lot better. It would really kind of clean up the spine, the parts of the spine that would be able to be seen between the signatures. The color goes well. It is a thin paper, so it's not going to add a lot of bulk, but it does make a nice clean finish. After working with this book a bit, and I don't know why, I really kind of wanted to clean up and freshen up the outer edge of the original book cover. So very carefully, I used a bit of the cut-off masking paper. I used my thin metal ruler there to protect the fabric underneath, and I am going in with some matte wax in sage leaves from Finnabair. And then, because you can never have too many things dangling out of a junk journal, I tear up some of the lace, kind of set it off center across the spine and across the front cover and the back cover. And then I add in the pattern paper that I had cut to fit on top of it and start really finishing up and adding the final details to my junk journal cover. Alright, I am using artist's tape. This is not regular masking tape. This is a light tack tape made to hold paper onto a drawing board. It was just easier for me to use it to block off the edge of my inside cover paper so that I could continue working my wax around all of my junk journal cover. Now, the reason that I am adding the wax now and not before and going through the extra trouble of taping off is I did not want wax where I also was going to be trying to glue things together. I wanted to make sure that the edges of my papers and the edges of my fabric had some good adhesion to the cover. You can see here why I did not worry about masking off the front of my cover where the fabric was going to be put down at. And that was because I had already put down double-sided tape all the way around the edges. So I didn't have to worry about the wax getting on the glue there, because when I peeled off the backing of that double-sided tape, it would just clean up any wax. I only worried about using that artist's tape to protect my tie where it came out of the cover. Alright, with that wax setting up off to the side real quick, I decided to tuck in a few more pieces into my signatures. I had just some short sheets, some I think it was some kind of packing paper there, some little envelopes that I closed up, trimmed off both ends so that they would be opened on both ends, and just tried to really make sure that all of my signatures were layered and about the same thickness with the same amounts of sheets in them, and ready to go to start having the holes pre-punched in them to get stitched into the cover. Alright, I just made myself a little template to the size of, I made it the size of the spine on the cover, and then evenly distributed the 3 lines for my 3 signatures, and evenly distributed the 5 holes on each line. I think they're 1/4 inch from the top and 1/4 inch from the bottom, not from the total height of the book, the inside paper, so that I would keep it centered on the inside paper of that cover. The envelopes that have that white lace on them, I don't punch holes in them. There would be nowhere for it to go, and I don't add any marks to it because it's white, and they're both on outside layers, so any marks would be seen. But when I do my punching with my awl, I just line up my folds and determine, like, this short piece is going to be at the bottom of the signature, so I kind of decide how I want it in there, how many. I want to make sure everything has at least 2 rows of holes in it, just so it doesn't spin. And I line it up and then just pop my holes in, just using the center line of this whole template. The 3 lines are only necessary for adding holes to the spine. On this music sheet, before I punched my holes in, I decided to fold down the top edge of the pocket and get that reinforcement fold on there before I stitched it in. And here you can see what I do for the other pages that do have the fabric hinge. I just line up and try to center the best I can, and then instead of punching holes, which would be harder to see because it would basically just push the threads apart, I use a fine tip Sharpie, and I just mark where I'm going to want my needle and thread to go through when it comes time to stitch everything in. And now all of my pages have their holes in place, and it is time to add the 3 rows onto the spine so that everything will be ready to be stitched. Alright, time to get my signatures in. Now I do mine a little bit differently than normal because I decided I wanted to try to kind of add some crosses, some cross stitching, large cross stitching along the back with my bookbinding thread. So I end up working with 3 threads, 1 for each signature. I did write down how I worked out my simple pattern there along the back, so next time I will only need to do 1 signature at a time. But since I decided to experiment for this junk journal, I was trying to do all 3 at once. I do start with the center hole, and I start on the inside and work my way out. When I get to the layers, well, when I get to the pages that have that white lace and those envelopes, I try to lay it down and I line it up with my template so that I can aim where I want the needle to come out. At least for that center stitch, it does get easier once things start staying in place. But for this first stitch, I do have it laid down just to make sure nothing shifts on me, so it will pretty much stay centered with the rest of the pages. I have all 3 of my center holes done, and then this is where I start trying to work out my pattern, and I'll leave the instructions on the blog post of how I crossed them over from which hole to which hole. Hopefully they'll make sense when you read them. I know what I meant when I wrote them down, but I'm aware that sometimes I don't explain things that make sense to anybody else. Alright, my signatures are all stitched in. I saved you from having to watch me try to work out my pattern there, but as I said before, I will put what I wrote down, my little notes to myself, on which holes that I went to and from on that. Hopefully it will make sense. So now, with the base of my junk journal put together, I am starting my work on my front panel, or my front cover pocket, and will be starting my work on all of my tuck-ins and ephemera pieces and little bits inside the journal. So to get started, I just put some white gesso on that Tres Jolie chipboard and let that dry. Alright, right here I was experimenting. I wasn't really sure where I was going or what was going to be going on. So I started out, I used some picket fence distress paint, I used picket fence distress stain, and I used the Lindy's Game sidewalk chalk, the flat Fabio spray. It just came in the August 21 mixed media kit. And then I dug into, I have had these perfect pearls for years now, and so I decided to kind of sprinkle on some of those perfect pearls, kind of mix the shimmer of that with the flat Fabio and the flat of the distress, and just kind of see what kind of white background I could get on these chipboard pieces, see how it would blend together, come in and use some saltwater taffy. I think that is just the distress spray stain, not the oxide. Let the colors mix together. I added some water, watered it down, really making it very soupy, making sure it would get into covering all of the edges of the chipboard. I was really just playing around here, just trying to get kind of a base coat, because I do come in and add some embossing glaze. Alright, after all of those mediums had finished drying and that chipboard was completely dry, I started working out my layout for this front pocket. I have some crocheted lacy bits, lacy strip here from Renee Bouquets. I used that frame on that chipboard over one of the flowers, and I just kind of play around a little bit, arranging the flowers from the Prima pack, just trying to get an idea of how things are going to look. I trimmed off the ends of this chipboard piece, and then I started working with the Kitsch Flamingo and the Saltwater Taffy Distress inks, and I would use one color at a time and come in, add a few spots of one color, and then top it with its coordinating embossing glaze. Alright, I just came in, cleaned up those ends that I had cut off, so I would only have the leafy flourishes left over, and then I used my ephemera sage leaves wax to add color to them. I decided that I wanted to add just a few metallic touches just to this cover here. So I used the Sterling Distress Foundry Wax and just added a few touches to the edges of the flowers, a few touches to the edge of the pocket, and a few touches just to kind of outline and highlight the flowers on the printed paper. And there you have it, the completed front cover pocket. Now, there isn't really a lot that happens from here on out. I just start placing corner pockets, tuck-ins, and decorating everything in the journal. For this pocket, I sewed bits of fabric together, and I added a zipper. I just had this old pink zipper, and I decided to see if I could make it work on one of these pockets. So I just stitched it in place, stitched it to my strips of fabric, and then just securely glued and used double-sided tape on that fabric wrapping, on the fabric pieces, to hold them down and to make sure that nothing stuck, because I do use a lot of glue. I have some parchment paper stuck in the pocket for any moisture that may soak through, and I use parchment paper to kind of wrap around this pocket just to protect the surrounding pages while it dries, or at least while the outside dries most of the way until it is safe to pull that parchment out. This pocket, like the zipper pocket, has also got a closure on it, except instead of a zipper, I stitched some Stampin' Up! Ribbon into it so it can be tied closed, and then just the same as the zipper pocket, I glued the fabric strips down in place. After I had cut the majority of my large pieces, I started using the leftover strips and the leftover strips of fabric and pieces of lace, and just started making some tuck-in spots that I could take over to my sewing machine and get stitched together and get ready to put into the journal on various pages. after I had dyed all of my fabric, I had a lot of the liquid left, and I decided that instead of just getting rid of that liquid, I would use it to make my own paper. That I added a few bits onto some tuck-in places, and in the finished journal I tucked in some of the rough-edged sheets. I really liked this strip that was left on this piece of paper, so I cut it into thirds, I rounded the corners, and then I used the last pieces of this lace to hinge them together and to make a hinge that when I put it in the book, I just glued it down into the spine. I set my book up like this and fanned out all of the pages now that everything was glued in place, and I let it dry overnight fanned out. When I got up the next morning, the only thing I had left to do was to add this front pocket. All of the glues are dried in my junk journal now, and I am just adding some more bits of paper. You can see some of my handmade paper there in the front pocket on the cover, in the front inside pocket. So now I just kind of want to go through and add a few little charms to some of the paper clips that I have in here. I have some little beads and some little kind of like rose hearts or rose charms. They're kind of like a mesh, I guess. Little rose charms. And I just, if they don't have a ring on them, like those two little white ones, I just clip or put on straight on the paper clip. A couple of them I added those little jump rings to, and then that star with the pink gems on it I added to my zipper pocket. Now you can see this is a nice thick junk journal. I have a lot of places to write. I have extra paper added in to write on, and I did make sure that my ties were secure. So as you can see, I do put a lot of pressure on those to tie it closed. I hope you enjoyed this junk journal, and it gave you some ideas of what you can do with the scrapbooking kit this month. What you could do to make your own your own personalized junk journal. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give us a thumbs up, and share this video. Thank you, and I will see you again next week.